Hello and welcome back. This is our last installment of our Chapter 16 lecture videos. This video is a little bit of a mixed collection of information. I'll quickly go over autonomic plexuses, that's more of an anatomy thing, visceral reflexes, and higher order functions of memory and states of consciousness. So the first topic, autonomic plexuses. In the textbook, it kind of goes along with dual innervation, but it's not really, it just is kind of showing all of the structures of what we just talked about, but in more of a realistic setting. So I'm going to highlight the plexuses, not the plexuses, sorry. I'm going to highlight the ganglia that we've been talking about. So the first kind of really obvious one is our sympathetic chain. I'll put this in kind of a light green. So the sympathetic chain goes all the way down both sides on either side of the spinal cord. So at every level of the spinal cord, there's going to be that bulge of the cell bodies where the preganglionic neuron synapses with the postganglionic neuron. So that was one of our locations of synapsing between pre and post in the sympathetic division. Here we have our celiac ganglion, our inferior mesenteric ganglion, and our superior mesenteric ganglion. So if we follow these, now I'm going to go back to pen because my highlighter is just so bulky, and these are actually pretty small. So celiac ganglion, superior mesenteric ganglion, and inferior mesenteric ganglion, just these little blobs. So going back again to the sympathetic video, we had those three places, or the three collateral ganglia that would be sending information, postganglionic fibers to the abdominal pelvic cavity. That's it, just these little blobs, collections of the ganglionic cell bodies that will send their postganglionic fibers to your visceral organs. I'm not going to be worried so much about the blood vessels because we haven't got there yet. But the other thing that they're listing here are plexuses: cardiac plexus, esophageal plexus, pulmonary plexus, inferior mesenteric plexus, a lot of plexuses. So what is a plexus? Well, you saw your spinal nerve plexuses. We had cervical, brachial, lumbar, and sacral. A plexus is just a collection of nerves, nerve roots. And so as your nerves are developing, so here's your central nervous system, and these nerve roots are going out to their destination, they don't always go in a straight line, right? That is not what happens. They go and blend and mix, and this is what we call a plexus. And that's how not only your spinal nerves leave your central nervous system before they reach their destination, but it's also how your visceral nerves go and reach their destination, leaving their ganglia before they reach their destination. So that's all I wanted you to take away from this picture of autonomic plexuses. Not so much to memorize the anatomy of it, but just to know that's where they are. That's how you can relate the chain ganglia to the collateral ganglia to all of these nerve roots of autonomic, postganglionic, and preganglionic neurons. All right, the next topic is visceral reflexes. So just like back in chapter 13, we were learning about the reflex arc and the different components. We can identify those here. So remember, there's 5 components of the reflex arc. We had our stimulus, get a darker color here. So we had our stimulus, we had our afferent fibers, we had the information processing, we had our efferent fibers, and we had the effector, the response of the effector. So we have all 5 steps of the reflex arc. We're just going to see things a little bit different because that motor pathway, remember, is different in the visceral. It's 2 motor neurons as opposed to just 1 motor neuron like in somatic control. And visceral reflex was one of the ways we could categorize our reflexes, right? We had monosynaptic versus polysynaptic, we had cranial versus spinal, we had learned versus innate, and we had somatic versus visceral. So visceral reflexes are just, this pathway of a reflex arc, but the effectors are smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, or glands, whereas your somatic reflexes are always skeletal muscle. All right, so there's 2 types of visceral reflexes, and you can see them here in the diagram, the short and the long. I'm going to work through the long reflex first, and we'll take a look at the short, because the long is more like what we are used to seeing from our knowledge of reflexes back in chapter 13. So if we start with our stimulus, right, so there's step one, activating our receptors in the peripheral tissue. Now this is most likely going to be like a visceral stimulus as well, visceral sensory, like a stretch in the wall of something. Let's do that. Let's use an example. Let's say the small intestine. Let's use that as an example. So we have a stretch, a stimulus showing up in the wall of the small intestine. Say food is coming in from the stomach and the duodenum extends or distends, and that's our stimulus. So that's activating our afferent fiber, right? So it's a peripheral sensory neuron. It just happens to be visceral sensory, unipolar neuron, cell body there in that dorsal root ganglia, dorsal root. We have our visceral sensory nuclei within that posterior gray horn of the spinal cord. It will synapse onto an interneuron. Okay, so it's a polysynaptic reflex. All visceral reflexes are polysynaptic. There's always going to be at least one interneuron. And then that is going to synapse with a preganglionic neuron. Okay, so preganglionic neuron, if we're going to the stomach, that's actually incorrect. It should be lateral gray horn right here, since it's a visceral. So lateral gray horn, all that whole pathway we just went through, I won't go through all of it again. Since we're going to the small intestine, it's going to be a collateral ganglia. If it's going to the intestine, probably celiac or maybe superior mesenteric. I'd have to look at the diagram again. And so now we are going to synapse onto our postganglionic neuron, which is going to go to the small intestine and increase motility. Okay. These long reflexes tend to control more of the organ as a whole. So this whole small intestine increasing motility. That's a better word. I know my writing is really bad on the computer screen. So that's a long reflex. So we use the central nervous system, the spinal cord in this case, as part of it. In a short reflex, we can do the same thing. We can have the same stimulus. So the duodenum is stretched, the duodenum is distended. I'll do a different color just for clarity. So here we have the stimulus, here we have activating the afferent neuron, but in this particular neuron, we can see it's still unipolar, okay? That neuron is going to go and communicate to the ganglia, in this case, probably in the wall of the small intestine, and more specifically in the wall of the duodenum, because short reflexes tend to be more local, where long reflexes might increase motility along the entire small intestine, the whole 21 feet of it. A short reflex is stretching at the duodenum. The sensory neuron goes to a ganglia in the duodenum and directly, well, with an interneuron, directly goes onto that postganglionic neuron. It bypasses the whole preganglionic pathway, and then we have effector, but in this case, it's going to be just the duodenum is going to respond because it's local. So think of long reflexes as organ-wide and short reflexes are local responses. And it could be the same stimulus. So we might have increased motility at the duodenum with this stretching, the stimulus of stretching. At the same time, we will get along the entire length of the small intestine contractions as well, thanks to the long reflex and its ability to send the message out to more destinations with those postganglionic neurons. All right, so those are visceral reflexes. Okay, they're all polysynaptic, either long or short. Okay, looking at my notes, make sure I'm not missing anything. Okay, the last topics that we're going to cover are the higher order functions, and it's just going to be memory and consciousness. So before we get into those higher order functions, there's 3 characteristics, again, just listed in the notes here. They involve the cerebral cortex. So remember, the cerebral cortex is the gray matter on all the surfaces of all the wrinkles. Go back to chapter 14 to review that anatomy if you need to. Cerebral cortex is required for these higher order functions. So consciousness has got to be a part of it, which is kind of the next one, involve both conscious and unconscious information processing. So yes, your consciousness is a part of it, but there's also going to be some unconscious processing happening at the same time. And lastly, these higher order functions are not part of the programmed wiring of the brain. They can be subject to modification and learned responses over time. So it's not an innate thing. I mean, the wiring can be kind of innate, like the neural pathways, but the usage of those neural pathways can be modified as needed over time. So the first thing we're going to take a look at in the higher order function is memory, which for A&P students is a big deal. It's a big part of your learning and going through this course. So hopefully this may help you improve your memory by looking at how memory actually works. So a couple of different types of memories, just kind of looking at the notes here, we have fact and skill memories. Fact memories would be like, you know, the capital of Oregon is Salem, the capital of California is Sacramento. Those are fact memories. Skill memories might be something that you do with your body, like a muscle memory. You may have heard that before, like driving a car. You have lots of memories on all the things you have to do when you drive a car or play an instrument or do a sport or tie your shoe. Those are all skill memories. Okay. And then all of those types of memories, we have short-term and long-term, right? So those terms should be pretty familiar to most people. So short-term memories are memories that last for a little bit of time. But if we don't consolidate those to long-term memories, they're gone, and we'd have to relearn that information. Of the long-term memories, there's what's called a secondary memory, which is like a long-term memory, but you could lose it. And then there's tertiary memories, which are long-term memories that you typically aren't ever going to forget. So some examples of tertiary memories might be how your face looks. You look at your face in the mirror all the time. You have that fact memory of the appearance of your face. And you aren't just going to wake up one day and forget what you look like. Or for me, the example that I always remember is I had a childhood phone number, and I still remember it. And I have not used that phone number. It was a landline way before cell phones when I was growing up here in Medford, 773-4670. That was my phone number when I was growing up, calling all my friends, because you had to memorize phone numbers because you didn't have a nice handy memory bank to put them in your cell phone. So that for me is a tertiary memory. It's probably been at least, 30 years, 20, 30 years since I've actually used that phone number, but it's still stuck in my brain. It has become a tertiary memory. I'm probably never going to forget it. I may, but as far as I know, it's a tertiary memory. So how do we switch back and forth? How do we take short-term memories and turn them into long-term memories? Well, you got to have a sensor, you got to have the input coming in, right? So you learn the phone number. That's your sensory information. You're reading the phone number or the definition of a word or the ability to do tying your shoe, right? So that's your sensory input. And you will remember how to do that or to recall that bit of information because you just did it. That's your initial exposure, and that's your short-term memory. Now, if you don't do anything with that, you're going to lose it. And some things that can facilitate the loss of that short-term memory are listed here in this purple box. So neural fatigue, okay, tired brain. Shock, like if that sensory bit of information came in during a car crash, you're maybe not going to remember all of the details of information that's coming in during that shocking experience. And interference by other stimuli while you are taking in that sensory input. All of those can lead to loss of that short-term memory. So maybe that's something that you can apply to yourself when you're learning your information. So if you are really tired from working all day or other obligations, or you're reading your book for 3 hours, don't ever do that. Your neurons are going to be tired. They're not going to be able to make that memory engram, that circuit of a neural pathway that's linked to that very particular fact or skill that you're trying to learn. If you are tired, you're going to have a harder time remembering that. Most people are under shock, but we are living in a time where shock could be, unfortunately, a little bit more of our daily routine. The other thing that's probably a little bit more common is interference by other stimuli. So when you are studying for your classes, not just A&P, but anything that you need to memorize or to learn to incorporate into your knowledge bank, are you listening to music? Well, that might be beneficial to some, but it could be distracting to others. Are you watching TV? Are you checking your social media? Are you talking with a friend? Are you trying to help your kiddo with their homework? That's interference. It's making it hard for that short-term memory to form and to stick, right? So try to avoid these situations that could make it harder for those short-term memories to be formed. Now, Okay, so maybe you're in a nice quiet place, you're focused, your brain is sharp, there's no distractions, you're not going through any mental or physical shock at the moment. So yes, okay, so I have my short-term memory. I'm learning a definition of a word. But I want to be able to remember that tomorrow, and I want to be able to remember that in 2 weeks for the test. So what do you need to do? You need to consolidate that to become a secondary long-term memory. And how do you do that? Repetition. What does Corey always say on how to increase your retention? Repetition, repetition, repetition. Memorize over and over and over again. Label your pictures, define your words, describe a process, write it down, and do it as many times as you need to until you can do it without looking at anything and without making mistakes. That's the only way you're going to know that that short-term memory has been converted into a long-term memory. But then you can't do it just one day, times 7 days. You got to do it every day until maybe you study it, and then 3 days later, without looking at it, you can still recall it. That's a good clue that you've converted that short-term memory into a long-term memory. Okay? So the locations of where these memories are stored could be in your cerebral cortex, mainly for your fact memories, your cerebellar and cerebral cortex for your skill memories, because remember that's motor control, your premotor cortex and your motor processing center, and your cerebellum is for kind of your three-dimensional position in space. And the hippocampus is also where our memories are stored. So that's where you might find them in your brain. Now, let's say you did really good. You converted your short-term memories to long-term memories. You remembered it for the test. That's awesome. You really nailed those questions on hypothalamus or reflexes, whatever the topic was. You're like, yeah, I did really good. But then let's say you don't study the brain for the rest of your life. Like A&P was the only time you ever needed to learn all of the cranial nerves. So if you don't ever expose yourself to the cranial nerve information, and then you become your nurse or your paramedic or whatever your career path is, and 20 years down the line, somebody's like, oh, you need to learn your cranial nerves. And you're like, I used to know my cranial nerves. I don't know my cranial nerves anymore, but you might have some familiarity with them. Maybe you'll remember the saying, oh, to touch and feel very good velvet ah. You might have a temporary loss in that 20-year period where you haven't reviewed cranial nerves, but you review it a little bit, they come back, and they can be that long-term memory again because you've already kind of have that engram going. But if you don't need to review it again, or it's gone so long that that temporary loss is turned into a permanent loss, when you learn the cranial nerves again 20, 30 years later for whatever reason, it would be like the very first time, and you wouldn't have any prior knowledge to back up with. You could still learn it from permanent loss, but you'd have to start all the way back here at short-term memory, consolidate to long-term memory. Okay, so some physiological things that are happening, right? So let us, oops, I wanted to do white. So let's say we have a synapse here. This is on like a cell body. Okay, so if this is the pathway of your, I'm going to actually make this a little bit smaller. So this is the pathway of your memory. So you make this memory pathway. That's your short-term memory. Then you do that repetition, repetition, repetition to long-term memory. There's a couple things that physiologically happen. So let's say in your short-term memory, you're releasing this much neurotransmitter, okay? A predetermined quantity. That repetition, okay, every time you fire that pathway, it will trigger the release of more neurotransmitter. Okay? That physiologically is a physical change in this pathway, which is going to help that postsynaptic neuron reach threshold faster because that graded potential will be larger. We will also get facilitation. So we'll get a collateral coming, maybe even a couple. Well, that's really bad. Now you have more than one synapse. So instead of one synapse with an increased level of neurotransmitter, now we have 3 synapses, and they're all increasing their amount of neurotransmitter, which is going to make that post-synaptic neuron reach threshold even faster. Okay. Formation formation of additional synaptic connections. We said that. Increased neurotransmitter release. Oh, facilitation was that presynaptic facilitation, right? So you might have another neuron coming in presynaptic and helping release that extra neurotransmitter. So all of these things are physically happening to those brain connections, those neuron to neuron connections in your memory engram that increases the ability for you to recall that bit of information. Okay? So there you go. So hopefully with that, now you have that knowledge about how your memory works. Utilize that, take advantage of this knowledge of how your brain works to increase your retention and your ability to learn your A&P stuff and other things better. Okay. The last higher order function we're going to talk about is states of consciousness. So we are all have varying states of consciousness. A regular kind of normal person is mostly awake during the day and asleep at night. We'll just kind of go with that very basic idea of our states of consciousness. So this is sometimes called your circadian rhythms or your sleep-wake cycle. But if you remember back in chapter 14, we talked a little about EEGs, electroencephalograms. We had the different alpha, beta, gamma, delta waves. So when you're awake, your brain electricity kind of sends off these kind of signals. When you're sleeping, it's still a little bit active in REM sleep, I should say, because that's your dreaming state. Your brain is still pretty active. The waves are a little bit more spread out. But then when you are in a deep sleep, when you're not doing any, your unconscious brain is not super active, this is kind of more of the rejuvenating part of your sleep, you can see these more like those delta waves. Everything's spread out, they're a little bit more smoother, they're not quite so erratic. So we can actually see our brain is doing different things at different states of consciousness. Okay. When we are sleeping, this is probably the most commonly experienced state of unconsciousness. Sleep is a type of unconsciousness. It is one that you can be roused from, usually pretty easily. And we go through these cycles between your REM sleep, your transition period, your deep sleep, and then we slowly come back up towards awake at the end of the night as your stimulus is changing, those reverberating circuits are changing. Other states of consciousness that aren't quite as common would be like an anesthesia, so a medically induced state of unconsciousness where the anesthesiologist is giving you drugs to change those reverberating circuits and turn off your level of consciousness. A more natural state of that would be like a coma. I know it's not natural in that it is not man-induced, right? So humans are not inducing it. Could be caused by traumatic brain injury, trauma, or infection. So those are some things that could trigger a coma. And comas are states of unconsciousness where you cannot be roused. Something else has to come in something has to be changed or fixed before consciousness can be aroused, and sometimes it isn't. And so people could stay in a coma for years and years and years. I've read articles of people waking up out of comas after 15 years. All their body functions are working fine. They just could not make that connection to that state of awakeness, the state of consciousness. And some people, unfortunately, don't ever wake up from a coma, and they just die, which is really sad. So the physiology, the anatomy and the physiology of states of consciousness, we can go back to our chapter 14 knowledge of that orange kind of wormy looking thing that went all the way through the brainstem and stopped in the midbrain, the mesencephalon. If you remember, this was our reticular formation, and then up here, this was our RAS, the reticular activating system. We talked about that as maintaining our sleep-wake cycles, and so we can see in this diagram, it is receiving input, general input from your spinal nerve, so sensory input. If somebody's like smacking you, hey, wake up, you're hearing them say, hey, wake up, or your alarm clock is going off, or the light is shining in your room, or somebody turned on the light. What's also not in here, but it should be, smell. So a lot of times, like if you have your coffee maker turned on or somebody's cooking breakfast and that smell can arouse you. So those are all sensory inputs that come in that are going to trip that reverberating circuit from maintaining unconsciousness to activating consciousness, which then is going to go up to all of your, cerebral cortex saying, whoop, I'm awake, probably doesn't happen quite like that in the morning. But then you're going to be now in these reverberating circuits of keeping that levels of consciousness going until then in the evening, again, a normal, what we call normal, awake in the daytime, asleep at night. But that's different for some people, especially if you're working graveyard. You're going to have other input, sensory input to come in and flip that back to the unconscious state. So it's getting dark outside. That's a visual stimuli. Sounds, it's getting quieter. You don't have the traffic. You don't have, those, you turn the TV off, those types of things. And then other chemical reactions are happening. Hormones are being circulated that turn down the activity of your reticular formation, switching you into the reverberating circuit of the unconsciousness cycle for your 5, 6, 7, 8, however many hours of sleep you get. And then it all goes starts over again with these different stimuli coming in and activating your reticular formation and arousing, bringing you back up to consciousness in that arousal. Okay, so that's kind of the natural way of things. So if you ingest anything that stimulates your reticular formation, that will stimulate your states of consciousness, like caffeine or an energy drink. Those types of things will kind of artificially stimulate your reticular formation, which will give you that sense of arousal and awakeness more than if you didn't consume those beverages. Or if you take something that's the inhibitory of your reticular formation, it makes you sleepy and drowsy. All right, so that wraps it up. That's our chapter 16. That also wraps up the content that will be on the first exam. So exam 1 covers chapters 13, 14, and 16. So we'll be doing that shortly. And then when we come back from the next exam, the first exam, we'll be doing chapters 17 and 18 is the content for the second exam. So just kind of keeping you on track of where we're headed. So I will see you next time. Bye.